Factsverse presents New information changes the Titanic story. If you're like most people, you've seen the Titanic movie. It's an action-packed love story which makes it a favorite for just about anyone. While many of the events from the film were based on actual history, there are some parts of history that were left out of the movie entirely, likely because they were too frightening. But some new information has come up which completely changes the story of the Titanic. Before we share that with you, help us share the word about Factsverse by clicking the like button. And also be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss our future videos. Number 1. Launching the ship. The RMS Titanic was one of the first cruise ships to ever travel in the sea. In 1912, when it was first unveiled, people got to see its massive size. It was 882 feet long and 104 feet high from the base to the top of the bridge. At the time, it was the largest man-made moving object in the world. Number 2. The passenger list. The Titanic had the most passengers of any commercial passenger ship to date. When it left port, there were over 2,000 passengers and crew members on board. When the ship hit the Iceberg on the way to New York City, many of the passengers found themselves trying to survive in that freezing cold water, and in the end, 706 people out of the 2,224 managed to survive. The sinking of the Titanic was one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. Number 3. The children on board. Back when the Titanic set sail, the ship was not as kid-friendly as many cruise liners are today. In fact, of the 2,200 people on board, only 109 of them were children. Sadly, of the 109 children under 14 years old, 53 of them died in the accident. Even though the protocol for the lifeboats was women and children first, these children never got a seat on any of the boats. Number 4. Ticket prices. If the Titanic were to set sail today, it would cost $83,200 to book a first-class ticket in a parlor suite. That is what it would cost today. Back then, it cost $4,350. For a first-class berth ticket, it would have cost $150, which would be about $3,000 today. If you were to buy a second-class ticket back then, it would have cost $60. A third-class ticket would have cost $30. Most people today wouldn't be willing to spend so much money on a cruise. Number 5. Predicting the crash. There have been many legends surrounding the Titanic, however, none of them are as chilling as this one. Just 14 years before the Titanic set sail, an author named Morgan Robertson wrote a book called Futility, the Wreck of the Titan. The book was a fictional story about the world's largest ship hitting an iceberg. Some say it was just a coincidence. Others believe that the author could predict the future. Number 6. A royal title. The Titanic's official name was RMS Titanic, and that stands for Royal Merchant Ship or Royal Merchant Steamer. What many people don't know is that it was not the only vessel on the water with this regal title. Back then, any British ship, whether it was military or civilian, used the RMS letters. It was a way to let the world know where the ship had set sail from. Number 7. The female crew members. The Titanic was known as the largest ship in the world, and it carried the largest crew in history. There were 885 crew members on the ship. Only 23 of them were women. Sadly, 668 crew members died when the Titanic crashed that night. Number 8. The richest passenger on board. One thing that they wanted to show in the Titanic movie was the immense wealth of the passengers on board. The richest passenger on the Titanic was a man named John Jacob Astor IV. He was traveling with his pregnant wife. Mr. Astor's net worth was close to $87 million at the time. That would be about $2.06 billion today. Sadly, he died while trying to get his pregnant wife on a lifeboat. He died that night in the water, but he did what he had to do in order for his wife and child to survive. Number 9. J.P. Morgan got lucky. Since people all over the world knew about the Titanic's plan to set sail, wealthy people all over the world were buying tickets. One of those people was J.P. Morgan, who was a banker and steel tycoon. He purchased a ticket, but at the last minute he had to cancel his trip, and that allowed him to avoid the tragedy that occurred on the Titanic. Sadly, he died only about a year later. Number 10. Coal by the ton. In 1912, ships were powered with a great deal of coal and a lot of manpower. To keep the Titanic's engines running, they had to burn 600 tons of coal each day. When the ship first set sail, there were 6,000 tons of coal on board. The crew members who were responsible for shoveling the coal into the furnaces were called firemen. Sadly, only a few of those men survived after being in the freezing water in nothing but light clothing. Number 11. The iconic stacks. Most people can distinguish the Titanic from other ships from the 4 iconic stacks that were part of the construction. They were also known as funnels, and they stood 150 feet tall. When all the ship's boilers were lit, they created 162 individual fires, and the smoke needed someplace to go. Only 3 of the stacks were used to push out smoke. The 4th was simply an air vent. Number 12. Many stewards perished. Since the Titanic was carrying many wealthy passengers, they were going to need people to care for the passengers, such as waiters, waitresses, and maids. These people were called stewards. They stayed in the lower cabins, and there were 421 on board when the ship set sail. Sadly, only 60 survived the night the ship sunk. Number 13. The Lost Boys. While the Titanic didn't carry many child passengers, it did carry a number of bellboys. These bellboys were as young as 14 years old, and they carried the passengers' luggage and performed other tasks. When the ship went down, none of these boys survived. They all lost their lives in the frigid water that night. Number 14. The survivors in the restaurant. The first-class passengers dined on the B deck of the aft grand staircase at the a la carte restaurant. The restaurant was owned by an Italian businessman named Luigi Gotti. He decorated the restaurant in the Louis XVI style with large picture windows. There were 66 people working at the restaurant the night the ship sunk. Only 3 survived. Luigi Gotti didn't even make it that night. Number 15. Ritz Inspired. In the film, Titanic director James Cameron wanted to show how amazing the interior of the ship was. It's said that the inspiration came from London's Ritz Hotel. The amazing details of the ship were talked about all over the world. On the Titanic, first-class passengers would enjoy a Turkish bath. They could use the fitness center, the pool, or the squash court, and they could keep their dogs in a first-class dog kennel. Number 16. Surviving in the water. Many people believe that the passengers who went into the water when the ship went down died, but that's not necessarily true. The lifeboats had just enough room for 1,178 people. That left about 1,000 people with no lifeboat to retreat to. These people had to wait in the water that was just 28 degrees, hoping and praying that help would come. Number 17. The docking route. The route of the Titanic was not a direct route. During its journey from Southampton to New York City, it had to dock. The first place it docked was in France and then in Queenstown, Ireland. Sadly, it never made it to its final docking point in New York because of the iceberg that it hit. Number 18. The Captain's Last Words. The captain of the Titanic was well-respected and very experienced. His name was Captain Edward J. Smith. According to those who survived the sinking of the Titanic, his last words to the crew were, "Well, boys, do your best for the women and children and look out for yourself." He was planning to retire when the Titanic docked in New York City. However, he died along with 1,500 other people. His body was never recovered. Number 19. Shilling Warnings. The crew of the Titanic knew that there were dangerous icebergs in the water. Several ships in the area sent messages to the Titanic to warn them of drifting ice in the ocean. Regardless of the warnings, though, the ship continued at full steam, which was the standard practice. Because the waters were so hard to navigate, it was too late to change course when the deadly iceberg was discovered. Number 20. The Lost Binoculars. If the iceberg could have been seen earlier, the crew may have been able to change course in time. The lookouts in the crow's nest on the night the ship struck the iceberg didn't have binoculars. According to survivors, they couldn't find the binoculars. If they had them with them, though, the tragedy could possibly have been avoided. Number 21. Photos of the iceberg. A day after the Titanic sunk, another ship in the area spotted the 100-foot iceberg that caused the ship to sink. They took a photo of the iceberg, and it became a piece of history. The photo reminds historians of the deadly waters and the iceberg that hit the starboard side of the ship and then punched a series of holes under the waterline. This caused all 5 of the watertight compartments to fill up and eventually sunk the ship. Number 22. Too late to turn. Many people wondered why the iceberg couldn't have been avoided. When First Officer William McMaster saw the iceberg, he suggested that they turn the ship immediately. Unfortunately, due to the size of the ship, they couldn't turn fast enough. The result was the deadly collision that killed about 1,500 people. Number 23. A 30-second window. When William McMaster saw the iceberg, it was only 30 seconds before the ship would crash into it. Most experts believed that there was nothing that they could do when the ship was that close to crashing. A ship of that size can't change its course in just a matter of seconds, which is what the Titanic would have needed to do to avoid hitting the iceberg. Number 24. Sinking for hours. In the movie Titanic, it took just minutes for the ship to sink. In real life, though, it took 2 hours 40 minutes for the ship to go down. It first went down at the bow, which caused water to spill into each of the compartments. When the stern rose out of the water, you could see the propellers of the ship. When the ship broke in two, it bobbed in the water vertically for several seconds. At this time, hundreds of people could be seen clinging to the ship until it went down. Number 25. The musicians. In the film, the musicians played up on the deck to calm the passengers. They played right up until the ship disappeared into the water. This is something that actually happened. All 8 men played until they could no longer play anymore. Sadly, none of them survived. However, they are all known for their heroism, and they will always be remembered. Number 26. The Speedy Descent to the Bottom. When the ship fell below water level, it took about 5 to 15 minutes to hit the ocean floor. Experts believe that the bow traveled 35 miles per hour before landing at the bottom. The stern half of the ship is said to have traveled about 50 miles per hour during its descent. Number 27. The Recovery. After the Titanic sunk, hundreds of people were left in the freezing water praying that help would come. It took close to 2 hours for a ship, the RMS Carpathia, to arrive on the scene. They took 710 people from the water that night, and then it took an additional 3 days for the ship to reach New York. When the sinking was confirmed and the public found out, the world mourned the people who were lost. Number 28. The Youngest Passenger. There weren't many children aboard the Titanic, but there were a few. The youngest passenger was a 2-month-old baby named Elizabeth Gladys Melvina Dean. When the ship hit the iceberg, Elizabeth's mother and her brother were placed in a lifeboat. They were the first third-class passengers to get into a lifeboat. Sadly, her father didn't make it. In 2009, at the age of 97, Elizabeth passed away. She was the last remaining survivor of the tragedy. Number 29. Elizabeth's Story. In 1912, Elizabeth and her family were on the Titanic to emigrate to Wichita, Kansas. There, her father was going to be the co-owner of a tobacco shop with his cousin. Initially, the family had no intention of boarding the Titanic. The plans changed when there was a coal strike. When she passed away in 2009, her ashes were scattered on the Southampton dock where she boarded the Titanic with her family. Number 30. Finding the Wreckage. It took many years to find the wreckage of the Titanic. It was over 12,000 feet below the ocean surface, which made finding it very difficult. In September of 1985, Robert Ballard found the wreckage off the coast of Newfoundland. Today, you can buy a ticket and take a Russian submersible ship down to see the wreckage. However, that costs $59,000 per ticket. If you want to see artifacts that were brought up from the ship, you can see them at the Luxor Las Vegas Hotel and Casino. Subscribe for more.